The forest has a way of keeping secrets, some too strange, too unbelievable for most people to ever accept. But imagine just for a moment that you were walking under its dark canopy and heard a sound so unusual, so heartbreaking, that it froze you in your tracks. A cry, not of any animal you'd ever known, not human either, but something caught in between. Would you follow it? The night was heavy, the air sharp with the scent of pine and damp earth. The world around seemed to hush as if waiting. Then it came again. A desperate, high-pitched wail echoing through the trees, trembling like a child's sob. It wasn't just one voice. There were two, maybe three. What kind of creature could it be? What kind of tragedy was unfolding in the dark, unseen? Most people would have turned away, convincing themselves it was just the wind or a trick of the wilderness. But what if you didn't? What if you stepped deeper into the shadows, drawn by that helpless sound? That's exactly what happened on that cold evening. And what was discovered tangled in the fence wires, struggling for life, would shake everything they thought they knew about the wild. Because these weren't ordinary animals. They were babies of something thought only to exist in legend. It was late autumn, the kind of season when the forest feels alive with whispers. The trees, stripped of most of their leaves, stood like skeletal guardians, their branches rattling in the cold wind. A silver moon floated above, dimly lighting the trail. Mist curled low across the ground, blurring the line between reality and imagination. Nights like these were made for stories, tales of things that hide in the shadows, waiting for the unlucky few who wander too far. On that night, the unlucky few were two friends, Daniel and Mark. Daniel was the kind of man who carried the wilderness in his bones. At 40, he was tall, lean, with a weathered face shaped by years of hiking, camping, and working outdoors. His dark brown hair was streaked at the edges with gray, and a stubble beard shadowed his jaw, giving him a rugged survivalist look. Daniel wasn't reckless, but he was drawn to mystery the way moths are drawn to flame. Mark, on the other hand, was his opposite in almost every way. Slightly younger, in his mid-30s, he had the build of someone who spent more time behind a desk than under the open sky, yet he carried a quiet strength in his frame, a steadiness that Daniel respected. Where Daniel chased adventure, Mark brought reason. Where Daniel wanted to explore, Mark wanted to understand. They weren't in the forest by accident. Daniel had invited Mark out to his family's old hunting cabin, miles away from the nearest town, hoping to give him a break from the grind of city life. The cabin sat on the edge of an abandoned stretch of farmland, long since reclaimed by the wild. Fields of tall grass brushed against the tree line and crumbling fences lined the property like forgotten scars. It was quiet there. Too quiet, some would say. At night, the silence pressed down like a weight. Even the owls and coyotes kept their distance, leaving the two men with only the sound of creaking wood and the crackle of their fire. But it was exactly this isolation, this untouched silence, that Daniel loved most. It was here, in the stillness, that he felt the pulse of the forest most clearly. Mark, though, couldn't shake the unease. From the moment they arrived, he had noticed the odd signs. Claw marks etched deep into tree trunks, patches of ground disturbed as if something heavy had passed through. And once, a massive footprint by the creek bed that neither man could explain. Daniel laughed it off as a bear, but Mark wasn't convinced. Something about the size, the shape, it was wrong. Too human, too deliberate. And so, as the two sat in the cabin that evening, the wind rattling the old windows and the moon casting strange shadows across the walls, they didn't yet realize that they were sitting on the edge of a secret the forest had been holding for centuries. A secret that was about to reveal itself with a sound they would never forget. It began with a sound. At first, Daniel thought it was the wind whistling through the half-broken fence posts. But when it came again, higher, sharper, trembling with panic, he froze. Mark, seated by the fireplace, glanced up, his brow furrowed. "Did you hear that?" Daniel whispered. Mark nodded slowly, his eyes darting toward the door. That wasn't an animal. They stepped outside into the night. The cold bit their skin, the air so sharp it stung their lungs. For a moment there was only silence. Then it came again, this time clearer, closer. A wailing cry, shrill and broken like a child calling for help. Every instinct screamed at them to turn back. Nothing good ever hid behind sounds like that. And yet something deeper, something human, pulled them forward. The grass, damp with frost, brushed against their boots as they crossed the field toward the tree line. Their flashlights cut through the mist, beams shaking with each step. Daniel's hand hovered near the hunting knife at his belt. Mark clenched the flashlight so tightly his knuckles went pale. The cries grew louder, not one but several. Weak, pitiful, desperate. When they reached the old fence that marked the edge of the property, the sound hit them full force. There, tangled in the rusting wire, small shapes writhed and struggled. At first, Daniel's mind tried to label them, fawns maybe, or stray dogs. But as the beams of light swept over the figures, his breath caught in his throat. They weren't deer. They weren't dogs. They were something else entirely. Tiny faces peered back at them through the tangle of wire, eyes wide and glistening under the moonlight. Their limbs, though covered in soft, dark hair, moved with a startlingly human rhythm. Fingers, actual fingers, clutched at the fence, trying and failing to pull free. "Dear God," Mark whispered, his voice breaking. "What are they?" Neither man moved. The night pressed down around them, the forest holding its breath. The cries echoed, urgent and helpless, as though begging for mercy. Daniel's flashlight shook in his grip. Every rational thought screamed to back away, to leave, to pretend they had seen nothing. But some things couldn't be unseen. Some mysteries, once revealed, demanded a choice. Were these creatures lost children of the forest, a species no one had ever documented, or something much older, much stranger, something they weren't meant to find? The questions hung heavy in the cold night air, unanswered as the tiny figures struggled in the wire, their cries piercing deeper into the men's hearts. Daniel was the first to step closer. His boots crunched against the frost-hardened grass, the sound far too loud in the silence of the night. The beam of his flashlight trembled as it fixed on the small forms entangled in the fence wire. There were 3 of them. Tiny, frail, their bodies no larger than a toddler's. But where a child's face would have been smooth and pale, these were shadowed by a fine layer of dark hair. Their heads were broad, their foreheads pronounced, their eyes enormous, dark pools glistening with tears. One let out a weak whimper, clutching the wire with a hand that had long, delicate fingers ending in short black nails. Another struggled feebly, but each twist only tightened the wire around its small arm, drawing fresh rivulets of blood. "Daniel," Mark's voice shook. "We can't just leave them." Daniel swallowed hard. "And if the mother's nearby?" The question hung heavy. Every hunter's tale, every whispered story of strange footprints and sightings came rushing back. If these were babies, then the adults couldn't be far. The forest around them seemed suddenly alive, branches creaking, the wind carrying faint rustles. The men turned their lights toward the tree line, half expecting to see glowing eyes staring back. But the woods stood still as though watching silently. Mark crouched, his breath misting in the cold. "They're suffering. Look at them." "We can't just walk away," Daniel hesitated. His instincts screamed to leave. Yet something in those eyes held him. They weren't the eyes of an animal. They were pleading, trusting. With careful hands, he pulled a multi-tool from his pocket. "Hold the light steady." Mark's beam illuminated the struggling creatures as Daniel began cutting at the wire. The first snip made one of the little ones flinch, a sharp cry escaping its throat. The sound was heartbreakingly human. Daniel worked faster, jaw clenched. Every cut seemed to echo into the night. The first creature came free, collapsing into the grass with a soft thud. It didn't run. Instead, it stared up at him with wide, unblinking eyes. Daniel had the strange, unnerving sense that it understood, that it knew he had helped. The second was harder. The wire had bitten deep into its leg, twisted so tightly that Daniel had to pry the strands apart with all his strength. When it finally came loose, the creature whimpered and clung to Mark's boot as though seeking safety. Mark nearly stumbled. "God almighty," he whispered, "it's hugging me." Daniel didn't answer. He was focused on the third one, whose arm was almost entirely ensnared. Blood matted the fur, and its cries grew weaker by the second. Daniel's hands shook as he worked, the cold metal of the multi-tool slipping against the wire. Finally, with a sharp twist, the last strand snapped and the creature fell limp into his arms. For a long moment, neither man moved. The 3 beings huddled together, trembling, their tiny chests rising and falling rapidly. Daniel's heart pounded in his ears. That's when he noticed it. Prints in the frost just beyond the fence line. Huge, broad, unmistakable. Footprints. They weren't fresh, but they weren't old either. The hair on the back of his neck stood up. "Daniel." Mark's voice was low, almost a growl. He had seen them too. The men exchanged a glance. Saving the little ones had been instinct, but now what? Returning them? Keeping them safe? or leaving them and fleeing before whatever made those prints came back. Before they could decide, a sound drifted through the trees. A long, low moan that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't any animal Daniel had ever heard. The babies froze. Then, as if in response, they began to wail again, louder, more frantic than before. "Is that calling them?" Mark whispered. Daniel tightened his grip on the limp one in his arms. Or calling to something else. They backed away slowly, but the forest erupted with sound. It began as a deep, guttural roar, so primal it vibrated through Daniel's bones. The trees themselves seemed to shudder, shedding frost from their branches. Mark froze in place, the flashlight trembling wildly in his hand, its beam cutting jagged lines through the night. From the darkness ahead, a shadow moved, enormous, slow, terrifying. The first thing Daniel saw were the eyes, burning amber, glistening with fury, locked straight onto him. Then the shape emerged, a towering figure covered in thick matted hair, its shoulders as broad as a doorway, its arms swinging low like heavy weapons. The breath from its mouth steamed in the cold air, each exhale like a warning. The babies shrieked, scrambling to hide behind Daniel and Mark, their tiny hands clutching desperately at boots and clothing. Daniel's heart thundered. He realized with a sinking horror what this meant. The little ones weren't orphans. They had a mother or perhaps a protector, and it had found them. The massive creature stopped only yards away. Its chest heaved and the ground seemed to quake beneath its weight. The moonlight revealed scars across its arms and chest, long pale lines that spoke of battles survived. This wasn't just a beast. It was a survivor, a warrior of the wild. Daniel raised his free hand slowly, his voice cracking. "We didn't hurt them. We helped." The words sounded fragile, useless against the storm before him. The Bigfoot's roar split the night, so loud Mark dropped the flashlight. The beam spun across the ground before dying, plunging them into near darkness. Only the faint glow of the moon lit the clearing now, painting everything in silver and shadow. Daniel felt the babies trembling against his legs. He could smell the creature now, a pungent mix of earth, musk, and wild fur. His survival instincts screamed to run, but the moment he shifted, those burning eyes sharpened, warning him, "Don't move." Then, in a single earth-shaking stride, it was closer. So close Daniel could see the steam rising from its body. The massive hand swung down, not in a strike but in a motion almost delicate. Two of the babies squealed and scurried forward, clinging to its leg with cries that sounded heartbreakingly like children calling for home. The Bigfoot lowered its head, emitting a low, rumbling sound. A sound of recognition, relief. But one baby stayed behind, the injured one Daniel had carried. It clung to his jacket, refusing to let go. Its tiny, bloodied hand tightened around his sleeve, eyes wide with fear. The great beast noticed. For a terrible moment, Daniel thought it would attack. The creature's chest heaved, its gaze fixed on him with raw intensity. Every muscle in his body locked tight, bracing for the end. Instead, something shifted. The fury in its eyes softened, replaced with a deep, almost human sorrow. The massive hand reached out, not to strike, but to take. Slowly, carefully, it lifted the injured little one from Daniel's arms. The creature cradled the baby against its chest, humming a low, resonant sound that seemed to calm it instantly. Mark whispered, barely audible, "It loves them." The moment was surreal, suspended in silence. The forest seemed to hold its breath. Then, from deep in the trees, another call rang out. Not a roar, something higher, sharper. An answering voice. More of them. The giant's head lifted. It shifted its weight, preparing to disappear back into the darkness with the little ones. But just before it turned, it locked eyes with Daniel once more. Not rage this time, not threat, but something else. A warning, a promise, and then it was gone. Branches snapped, the ground shook, and within moments the clearing was empty. Only the smell lingered. Only the footprints remained. Daniel and Mark stood frozen, their lungs burning as though they'd forgotten how to breathe. Mark finally whispered, "Did that just happen?" Daniel couldn't answer. His hands still tingled where the small fingers had clung to him. His chest ached with the weight of what he had seen, something no one would ever believe. Something too impossible, too wild. And yet the evidence lay all around them. The trampled grass, the broken wire, the blood smeared on Daniel's jacket. Proof that they had touched the impossible. Proof that the stories weren't just stories. But even as relief trickled in, so did dread. Because the look in that creature's eyes had spoken louder than any roar. This wasn't the end, it was a warning. Silence reclaimed the forest. Daniel and Mark stood there for what felt like hours, though only minutes had passed. Their legs trembled, their breaths uneven, as if their bodies had only now realized they had survived. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, but beneath it lingered that wild musk, faint but unforgettable. Mark bent down, retrieving the fallen flashlight. The beam sputtered back to life, illuminating the broken fence wires where it had all begun. Only now the wires seemed insignificant, just twisted metal under the pale glow of the moon. What had happened here was far greater than any fence, any trap, any human-made boundary. Daniel stared at his jacket, smeared with streaks of blood from the injured baby. He ran his fingers over the stains, his mind replaying the image of tiny hands clinging to him, refusing to let go. For a moment, he had been more than a witness. He had been trusted, needed. They're real, Mark whispered, still staring into the trees as if expecting the towering figure to return. His voice was low, reverent. All those stories, every crazy rumor, real. Daniel nodded slowly, but with the awe came a gnawing unease. The look in the creature's eyes haunted him, a mixture of warning and sorrow. It hadn't been just a mother retrieving its young. It had been a protector guarding a secret older than the forest itself. What if they don't want to stay hidden anymore? Daniel said softly. Mark turned to him, the question sinking in like a stone into deep water. Neither man had an answer. The forest creaked and whispered with night sounds, the hoot of an owl, the snap of branches in the distance. Yet everything felt changed, charged, as though the woods were now watching them back. Daniel finally broke the stillness. We should go. They retraced their steps in silence, the trail familiar yet strange, every tree seeming taller, every shadow heavier. By the time they reached their truck, dawn's first light was breaking through the horizon, painting the world in pale blues and golds. Neither spoke on the drive home. Words seemed too small, too fragile for what they had witnessed. But both knew this night would live in them forever, etched into their bones, stitched into their breath. As the road stretched out before them, Daniel glanced back at the tree line fading into the distance. Somewhere out there, in the deep, unbroken wilderness, a family of giants walked free. And he couldn't shake the feeling that their paths would cross again. Long after the forest faded in the distance, its memory lingered like a shadow that refused to lift. Daniel found himself lying awake at night, replaying the cries of the little ones, the look in their dark, intelligent eyes, the towering silhouette that had vanished into the trees. It wasn't just an encounter. It was a reminder of how small, fragile, and blind humanity truly was. Legends, he realized, are not born from imagination alone. They are whispers of truths too immense to be spoken aloud, truths the world is not yet ready to face. And he had touched that truth, carried it in his arms, felt its trembling heartbeat against his chest. He often wondered if the forest would call him back. If one night the cries would echo again, drawing him into that hidden world. Or perhaps, he thought, they were watching already, keeping their distance, guarding their secret, waiting for the day when the boundary between myth and reality would finally shatter. Mark never spoke of it again. But Daniel knew the silence was not denial, it was reverence. A secret too sacred to share. The world moved on, unaware. But in the quiet corners of the wilderness, something ancient still breathed, still watched, still lived. And if you ever hear a cry in the night, one that doesn't sound quite human, ask yourself, would you dare to follow it? Because some secrets of the wild are not meant to remain hidden forever.